The goal for this first exercise is to design this boarding pass layout. We'll be using the constraint layout to do so. The provided code contains a default empty relative layout. Also, if you check the strings.xml file, you'll find that we've created all the text that should appear in the UI as string resources. Since we're only focusing on getting the design correct for now, we will just use those hard-coded strings. And then later, we will see how to bind the UI with actual data. The constraint layout is built as a separate support library that works on all Android versions back to the Android 2.3. So the first step before we start is to add the following compile dependency. This compile dependency allows us to use the constraint layout. Make sure that you're using the latest version. At the time of this recording, it was still beta. Once you add the compile dependency, don't forget to sync your project. Now that we have the dependency added, let's go back to our layout and replace this relative layout with a constraint layout. Now if we go to the design mode and try to drag in a text view, say, into the visual editor, it will stay where you put it. This is just to make the process less annoying. But if you don't create any constraints around this text view, like we will see later, at runtime, this view will just go to the default top left corner. So to define a view's position in a constraint layout, you must add 2 or more constraints for each view. Each constraint represents a connection or alignment to another view or to the parent layout. So for the constraint layout to know where to place this view, you have to define at least 1 horizontal and 1 vertical constraint. Sometimes you'll probably need more than that. Now assuming we're going to use this text view as the passenger's name label, we want to have a margin on top of that and a margin on left of that with 16 dps. You can start by just dragging this constraint circle here all the way to the top of the parent, which basically means we want to make sure that this text view is 16 pixels, as you can see here, from the top of the parent. And if we do the same from the left side, then we've got our 2 constraints. It might be hard to visually see what just happened in the design mode. So let's switch to the text mode and have a look at what the generated text was. You can see that the default layout width and height were wrap content. It generated an ID for us, which we will rename later. And it created a constraint top and constraint left for us. The top constraint is pointing to the top of the parent, and the constraint left is pointing to the left of parent. It's also set the margins for top and left to be 16 dp, and the margin start is just for accessibility in case you're changing your UI from right to left to right. We'll talk a lot more about this later. Perfect, so let's go ahead and change the text value to one of the string resources that we had, which was passenger label. And let's also change the ID to something more readable. I'd also like to add a text appearance tag to set the style to the AppCompat caption style. Now let's have a look at the design to see what it looks like now. Very good. So let's add another text view for the actual passenger's name. We'll just drop that down here and then create a constraint underneath the label, and the left constraint can be equal to the same left of the actual label up here. So let's go back to the text view and see what that generated for us. The first constraint is a top constraint, and it's to the bottom of our passenger label. And the left constraint is to the left of our passenger label as well. This means that they will always have the same left and that the name would be underneath the label. Because of these new constraints that we just created, if I just hold on to the label and drag it to the side, it would move the other text view with me, maintaining the constraints that we just created. Pretty cool. Now let's set the text for the passenger's name here. However, you should never use the Android text attribute to set fake data. That's why Android introduces a text attribute in the tools library for that sole purpose. If we set any fake data here, this passenger name would actually appear in the design mode, but once you run the app, it will not display that value. But that's all we need to help design this app for now. Now let's go back to the text view and change its ID to something more readable as well. And then I'd like to change the style and color to be display 1 and color primary. Let's have a look at the design. That looks much better. So let's move on.